Lockwood family moved into their new home on a crisp autumn afternoon. The house, a Victorian structure standing at the edge of a sleepy town, had been on the market for years. Its dark wooden exterior loomed under the gray sky, the sharp gables clawing at the air like skeletal fingers. The real estate agent had muttered something about history, but the price had been too good to ignore. Jonathan and Meredith Lockwood had been searching for a fresh start. Their children, 11-year-old Emily and 8-year-old Ben, explored the house with excitement, their laughter echoing through the empty halls. The house had character, they all agreed. Its grand staircase, the intricate carvings on the walls, the vast attic filled with forgotten relics of the past. As night fell, a cold wind whispered through the cracks in the window panes. The first sign of something strange happened just past midnight. Jonathan, lying half awake in bed, heard it. A faint, rhythmic scratching. It was so soft he might have imagined it, but when it returned the following night, louder and more distinct, he couldn't dismiss it as a trick of the mind. Meredith heard it too, a slow, persistent scraping that seemed to come from inside the walls. They brushed it off as rodents. Old houses always had them. But the sound continued, growing in strength, moving from one part of the house to another. Some nights it seemed to follow them. Emily and Ben soon noticed it as well. Emily claimed she felt something pressing against the wall beside her bed. Ben, too afraid to sleep alone, insisted he saw the wallpaper ripple, as if something inside was trying to push its way out. The scratching became part of their nights, growing in intensity with each passing evening. Then came the whispers, faint and broken, as if carried through the walls from some distant, suffocating space. Yet, it was only the beginning. The scratching did not stop. If anything, it became worse. At first, Jonathan tried to ignore it. Old houses made noises, wood settled, pipes groaned. But this was different. The sounds had rhythm, a deliberate movement. Scrape, pause, scrape, like something or someone trying to dig its way out. During the day, the house was still and silent, as if nothing were wrong. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting warm golden beams onto the hardwood floors. The scratching only came at night, just past midnight, creeping along the walls like an unseen parasite burrowing deeper into their home. Meredith began losing sleep. She lay awake, stiff with tension, ears straining in the dark. Sometimes she felt the mattress tremble, as if something was shifting inside the very structure of the house. One night, she swore she felt a faint tapping beneath her pillow. Emily and Ben were even worse. Ben refused to sleep alone, curling up in his sister's bed, burying his face in her shoulder whenever the sounds began. Emily, always the rational one, tried to explain it away. Rats, wind, an overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew better. The house was not right. One night, Jonathan had enough. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he searched the house. He checked the basement first, nothing but dust and forgotten furniture. The attic was silent, the air stale and heavy. But when he pressed his ear against the walls, he could hear it. Something was moving. Determined, he tore into the drywall in the living room, expecting to find rats or broken pipes. But there was nothing, only an empty space between the walls. No nests, no signs of life. Yet the sounds persisted. That same night, Emily woke up gasping for air. She sat up in bed, clutching her throat. The room was stifling, as if something unseen was pressing against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Ben whimpered beside her, pointing at the wall. The wallpaper bulged outward, swelling and contracting, as if it were breathing. The scratching came again, this time frantic, desperate. Then, in the silence that followed, they heard something worse. A low moan. A voice, muffled and distorted, whispering from inside the walls. Meredith wanted to leave. She begged Jonathan to take the kids and go just for a few nights, just to clear their heads. But Jonathan refused. They had spent everything on this house. There was nowhere else to go. Then, the knocking started. It came at 3 a.m. loud, insistent, rattling the headboard of their bed. Jonathan sat up, heart pounding, staring at the darkened room. He reached for Meredith, but she was already awake, frozen in fear. The knocking grew louder. It was coming from inside the walls. Something was trying to get out. Jonathan jumped out of bed, yanking open the door to the hallway. The house was cold, colder than it should have been. He could see his breath in the air. The scratching, the knocking. It was everywhere now. Down the hall, Emily and Ben were screaming. Jonathan ran to their room, throwing open the door. The wallpaper on the far side of the room was peeling, curling at the edges, as if some great force was pushing from behind it. Long, jagged scratches marred the surface. And then, before their eyes, the wall split open. A fissure, jagged and dark, ran from floor to ceiling. Something was inside. Something moving. Shadows twisted within the opening, stretching outward like grasping fingers. A foul smell poured into the room, damp and rotting, like soil that had never seen the light of day. Then the whispering returned, low, frantic, layered voices overlapping in a rising, unintelligible chant. Emily and Ben screamed as the fissure widened. Jonathan grabbed them, dragging them out of the room as the walls convulsed, the entire house seeming to shift and breathe around them. Meredith stood at the top of the stairs, eyes wide with terror. "We need to go," she whispered. Jonathan nodded, pushing past her, carrying the children in his arms. They made it down the stairs, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The front door stood open. Had they left it that way? But as they reached the threshold, something slammed it shut. The locks clicked into place. Trapped, Jonathan yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around them groaned, the house shuddering like a living thing. A terrible sound rose from the floors, a deep, hollow laughter that echoed from the very foundation. Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed them, thick and suffocating. Meredith grabbed his arm, fingers ice cold. Emily sobbed, her small hands clinging to his shirt. And then, in the pitch black, the whispering returned. Closer this time, right beside them. Jonathan turned, squinting into the dark. His breath caught in his throat. A face stared back at him, pale, sunken, twisted with pain. More faces emerged from the walls, their eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. The wallpaper stretched, bulging outward, faces pressing against it like drowning victims trapped beneath ice. The house was full of them, and they were hungry. The whispering rose into a deafening wail. The walls split apart, revealing endless darkness beyond. Shadowy figures crawled out, dragging themselves across the floor. Jonathan turned to his family, his voice raw with terror. "Run!" But it was too late. The house swallowed them whole. The Lockwood family was never seen again. Days passed, then weeks. The house stood silent, its dark windows reflecting the empty street. No one in town noticed their absence, not at first. The Lockwoods had only recently moved in, after all. They had no friends, no close neighbors who would check in on them. But the house knew. Inside, the air was thick with something unseen, something that lingered, The furniture remained untouched, their belongings still in place, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment. A half-finished breakfast rotted on the kitchen table. Emily's stuffed rabbit lay on the staircase, its fur damp, matted, as though it had been left out in the rain. The beds were still made, though the pillows bore the faint impression of heads that had last rested there. The only signs of struggle were the walls. Deep, jagged scratches ran along the wallpaper, as if something had been dragged across them in a final, desperate attempt to cling to this world. Some scratches led toward the doors, toward the windows, places of escape that had never opened. Others vanished into the floors, the ceilings, as if the house had simply swallowed them up. It was the mail piling up that finally drew attention. After weeks without a response, a postal worker reported it. The police arrived, knocking at the heavy oak door. No answer. The front door creaked open at their touch. A wave of cold poured out, unnatural in the late autumn air. The officers exchanged uneasy glances before stepping inside. The silence was wrong. Houses had a way of holding on to life, even when empty. The faint hum of appliances, the distant ticking of a clock. But this house had none of that. The air was dead, thick with something invisible that pressed against their skin, that listened. They searched the rooms, found the untouched belongings, the uneaten food. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no broken glass, no blood. The Lockwoods were simply gone. Then one of the officers saw it, the scratches on the walls. They weren't just in one place. They were everywhere. Deep, jagged marks stretching from floor to ceiling, looping in chaotic patterns, clawing their way toward the doors, the windows. Some were small, as if made by tiny fingers. Others were long, gouging deep into the wood. And the wallpaper. The floral patterns seemed to have shifted. The delicate vines and petals had twisted, curling inward, forming shapes that had not been there before. Faces, dozens of them, some frozen in horror, others twisted in agony. And the whispering, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a breath beneath the floorboards. The officers didn't stay long. They filed their report, labeled the family missing, and left the house as they had found it. The case went cold. No one wanted to return. Time passed. Dust settled over the Lockwoods' belongings. The seasons changed, the leaves falling from the trees, then returning in the spring. Yet the house stood untouched. The town whispered about it. People walking past at night claimed they saw shadows moving behind the curtains. A few kids dared each other to step onto the porch, but none ever made it past the threshold. Those who listened closely swore they could hear something moving inside. A low, steady scratching, as if the house were breathing, waiting. Then one day, a for sale sign appeared. A young couple from out of town, Darren and Lucy Caldwell, saw the listing online. The price was unbelievably low. The house was beautiful, they thought. Victorian, spacious, full of history. A dream home. They arrived on a bright summer morning, smiling as they unlocked the door for the first time. The air inside was cool, almost welcoming. The floors creaked beneath their feet as they explored. Everything had been left behind. Furniture, dishes, even clothes in the closets. It was as if the previous owners had simply vanished overnight. That night, Lucy lay in bed, running her fingers across the headboard, admiring the intricate carvings. Darren was already asleep beside her. The house was silent. Then, just past midnight, a faint, rhythmic scratching echoed through the walls. She sat up, listening. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. The sound was so soft she might have imagined it. But downstairs, near the front door, the wallpaper shivered. A single, brittle crack split along the surface. And beneath it, something shifted. Something waited,